Good. Well, let me just start by thanking our hosts and the organisers, and of course I thank particularly them for the fact that I've been invited. I'm sure this is going to be a wonderful set of days. Let me start by saying that what I'm going to present now is really only a workshop contribution. I hope it's a work in progress, although that remains to be seen, but it's not a polished and complete paper. If an excuse for this is needed, perhaps it's enough to note that the area indicated in my title is vast, dense, and complicated. This is the area where ethics, religion, and theology overlap and are tangled together in multiple ways. Today, I'm going to follow for a short distance just one of many possible paths that one might take into or even through this jungle. So this paper has two parts. It's a sort of simple organisation. In the first part, I'm going to present and compare two models for the relation between God and human beings in the realm of ethics. And the second part, which is shorter, is entitled Perfectionism and Practicality. So the two models of God's relation to human ethics are, on the one hand, the idea of God, and I'm going to sort of shift between the singular God and the plural without apology, because it's different in different contexts. So that in the first model, or the first of these two models, is the idea of God as the ethical authority. That's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, there is a model in which the idea of God is the idea of God as a paragon, or a paradigm, or an exemplar, an ideal exemplar for human beings. I'm not claiming that these are the only models for the relationship, but they stand out as being pretty familiar. I'm going to present them here just as tools of analysis. One would not expect a real-world religion, especially any religion with a long history, to conform precisely to just one of these models without admixture from the other. Let me just illustrate this point with one well-known example. The Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, in many ways incorporate the authority model. God is the authority for human ethics. And yet it's said very early in the book of Genesis that God made man, or man and woman, the human being, in his own image. This is said as part of the creation story, which means that it precedes any mention of God as laying down commandments or prohibitions to human beings, even the prohibition in the Garden of Eden not to eat from the tree of knowledge. The idea that God made man in his own image obviously introduces the model of the divine paragon, somehow or other. Thus, we have both models, the authority one and the paragon one, at the foundation of the Abrahamic religions. Whether they can be coherently combined, or whether they generate tensions between them, is partly the topic of this paper. But to pursue that topic philosophically, one obviously has to separate the models and draw out the structure and implications of each by itself. So looking at them strictly as models rather than descriptions of historical and actual or once actual religious cultures, one can make a number of points. My first point is that these two models have very different implications for the content of ethics. If we think of ethics as the law given by God to human beings, God being the authoritative source of that law, we shall tend to think of this divine authority as standing comprehensively behind the whole of human ethics, whatever exactly we want to include under the label of ethics, or human ethics. By contrast, the divine paragon model does not push us in this direction. It is consistent, perhaps, with a development in this direction of comprehensiveness, but it does not compel it. For it is logically possible that there are some departments or some department within human life, a subsection, in other words, of human life, where it is ethically incumbent on us to regard God or the gods as paragons for us, even though there are other parts of ethical life where this is not the case. The most obvious example of this subsection outlook with respect to the divine paragon comes at the end of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, where he recommends making ourselves more godlike by engaging in purely theoretical activity, the activity of pure science and philosophy. And Aristotle's argument, some passages in the Politics are also relevant here, his argument makes it plain, I think, that this recommendation of his on how to, that this is a recommendation on how to employ one very circumscribed area of human life, namely the area of leisure or time free from ordinary practical obligations, or maybe from practical obligations altogether. Aristotle, in other words, does not recommend that we strive to be godlike in every area of life, but just in this one rather special area, an area which hardly exists in the lives of very many people, as Aristotle must have known. Now, Plato, on the other hand, while largely following the paragon model, develops it quite differently and in a non-restricted way. In the Republic, he is mainly concerned to reject the gods of traditional myths as false paradigms for children. The gods, he says there, can only be good and sources of only what is good. But Plato, in the Republic, is quite vague about what this positively consists in. He's only concerned about avoiding youthful exposure to paragons, divine paragons, or supposedly divine paragons, that would undermine, if we do admire those paragons, what we already know, or we think we know, to be correct human morality. Plato is not here introducing the good divine paradigm in order to add anything new or surprising to ordinary human morality. However, in his dialogue Timaeus, which is mainly about cosmology, there is a very important God which is offered in a more positive way as a paragon or paradigm for human beings. The God that I'm talking about in the Timaeus is not the craftsman God whose intelligence constructed the universe from unordered matter. The God that I'm talking about, who amongst other things is a sort of paragon for us, is a created God. It is a created cosmic God whose body consists of, or at any rate contains, all physical matter, and whose soul incessantly thinks, and at the same time, somehow, it's almost the same activity as the activity of thinking, maintains the world in astronomical rotation. Now, according to this Timaeus account, which of course is Plato's new philosophical myth about the gods, the cosmic God's soul, which is often called the world soul in commentaries, stands in a relation of close similarity to the rational soul of human beings, although reason in us is vastly inferior because of the pressures of life in a mortal body. We, in the Timaeus, are advised to make ourselves more godlike by contemplating and studying the movements of the heavens, by watching the cosmic God in action, so to speak. The idea is that this will literally help the movement of our own intellect to sort of calm down, to tranquilize itself, and to become as regular as it should be. Well, what is the relevance of this to human ethics? Plato, the answer to that is that Plato postulates a close affinity, or maybe even identity, between some mathematical kind of order and the order, balance, proportion, and harmony of ethically healthy souls and ethically good conduct. Moreover, Plato postulates that the world soul and the human rational soul are constructed literally mathematically on mathematical principles. And that, of course, is also true, being constructed mathematically. That is true of a great deal else in Plato's universe. So, in the Timaeus, the bridge between human godlikeness and human ethics, the bridge that makes it ethically incumbent on us to make ourselves more godlike, depends on Plato's mathematicization of rational order in the soul, and on his assumption that in the human case, such order in the soul translates into ethical goodness. Aristotle, this is quite a familiar point, I think, by contrast, completely rejects this mathematical approach to reason, that is, to, as it were, the psychology of reason, and he equally rejects this mathematical or mathematizing approach to ethics. Let me now return to the comparison of our two models. It's worth noting that each of them admits of a distinction between, on the one hand, the content of the ethical message that we're supposed to receive in whichever model it is, and on the other hand, our motive for trying to live in accordance with this message. In the authority model, the motive, our motive, is obedience to the God, or the love which shows itself primarily in obedience. In the paragon model, the human motive has to be, I think, a desire existent in human beings, even if often unrecognized or misunderstood, to become, a desire to become in some way godlike. Of course, this desire cannot operate as an ethically acceptable incentive unless it is permissible or even good for creatures like us to become more godlike. And on this point, there is an important contrast between the Abrahamic tradition and some of the tradition behind the ethics of Plato and Aristotle. In the Abrahamic tradition, common sense takes it for granted that if God, the creator of the universe, and in the same tradition, not incidentally, also the saviour and protector of his people, whoever they may be, common sense takes it for granted here that if God, the creator, tells us to behave in certain ways, then it is ethically right for us to do so. Whereas in the tradition leading up to Plato and Aristotle, there was a significant strand that said that human beings should definitely not aim to make themselves like gods, that to do so shows extreme ethical foolishness. And of course, many of the traditional myths illustrate this lesson. I turn now to another difference between the two models. The authority model in itself, I think, says nothing about the nature of the divine in itself. That is, the nature of the divine as it would be even if beings like us had never existed. The authority model in itself tells us nothing and demands from us no speculation on what God is like apart from his role as our ethical authority. If he has, I'm going to say he, and I'm sure I will be forgiven for that, if necessary. If he has a life of his own, so to speak, its nature, the nature of his life, the life he has of his own, its nature is no business of ours. Our business in relation to him is to carry out his law in obedience. Thus, it logically could be the case that God in himself has and instantiates values that we cannot begin to comprehend. And that situation is perfectly fine, it's okay. Presumably, any, so to speak, private values that God has must at least be consistent with his role as ethical authority for us. But that's all. By contrast, the paragon model implies, I think, that we can and should form some idea ourselves of what God or the divine is like in itself, since otherwise we cannot take it as our paradigm or our paragon. The divine has to have a certain nature before it can function as a paragon, that is logically before. And it is a paragon or a representation of that nature. And in order for the divine to function as a paragon of its own nature for us, we must have, or at least we must think that we have, some grasp of this prior nature of its. Thus, Greek ethical reflection, so far as it incorporates the paragon model, necessarily, or anyway naturally, leads to the activity of theologizing, whereas the Abrahamic tradition, in its original form, expresses itself in religion and morality, and hardly at all in theology concerning the intrinsic nature of God. Here, to continue, are two more contrasts between the models. First, the authority model must assume that the God who is the authority actually and really exists. A non-existent being cannot be an authority, or at any rate, it cannot be an authority to existent beings. And of course, at least we know that we exist. But the paragon model does allow its adherents to hold that the divine paragon is merely an ideal. This can remain, or it can remain a paragon as long as we believe that it is ethically incumbent on us to become as godlike as possible, even if we cease to believe that there actually exists in concrete reality something or someone that corresponds or fully corresponds to this ideal. Secondly, there is the related point that in the context of the authority model, we cannot, at the risk of incoherence, try to determine by some independent standard what the authority wants us to do. For in that case, the authority becomes ourselves, or the authority is that independent standard. By contrast, the paragon model implies that we must acquire for ourselves an idea, some kind of an idea of what God is like, or what God would be like if such a thing as God really did exist. But of course, this aspect of the paragon model holds only on the assumption that it is ethically appropriate for us, at least in some part of our life, to aspire to be godlike. This consideration leads to the question of how do users of the paragon model arrive at some understanding of what divinity is like or is in itself, and also how do they reassure themselves that it is appropriate for human beings to make God their ideal, that is a human ideal, since this cannot be taken for granted. Here I'm simply going to briefly mention Plato's and Aristotle's approaches to these questions. Plato's approach, as we've seen, rests on a postulated affinity between the world soul and human reason. together with two conflations: the conflation of ethical goodness with rational well-functioning, and the conflation of rational well-functioning, which is a psychic or psychological condition, with the maintenance of a certain mathematical-like structure. Aristotle rejects this idiosyncratic and intensely a priori mathematical perspective on ethics and psychology. But in one way, Aristotle's approach does have something in common with what we find in Plato's Timaeus. And this common element is a theme that has roots in earlier literature. I'm referring to a way of understanding what a god is like, or what it is like to be a god. This is a rather primitive form of negative theology, in which divinity is conceived of as free from death, from aging, illness, weariness, not dependent for its existence and its flourishing on any external environment, completely invulnerable to disturbance. In other words, its life is one of perfectly autonomous, independent, unimpeded, incessant, happy or blissful activity. Plato in the Timaeus derives concerning his cosmic god the conclusion that this god, rather peculiar conclusion from our perspective, the conclusion that this god is a perfectly spherical being, it is cosmic being, that contains within its body all the matter of the universe. Plato calls it a zoon, which is the word that we usually translate as animal. It seems very strange to us to think of God as an animal, but that's how we are supposed to think of it, of this God in the Timaeus. Unlike familiar animals, this supreme animal, or living being, has no sense organs, no organs of nutrition and locomotion, since there's nothing beyond it or, for it to perceive, nothing on which it needs to feed, and nowhere for it to go to. Plato, I'm just summarizing basically Plato's reasoning. He is applying essentially biological categories to the limiting case of the perfectly independent animal. He applies these categories while at the same time stripping away everything that implies dependence on an environment. What is left, the cosmic god, is an animal. I think Plato thinks it's an animal in exactly the same sense as human beings and birds and fishes are animals. Each kind of animal has just what it needs and no more than it needs for living its characteristic life. Aristotle, in his Ethics, takes this stripping away process one step further, still proceeding on the basis of the god's perfect independence. Aristotle strips away any social or ethical context that necessitates such human excellences as justice and temperance. And yet, of course, the gods must be supremely excellent. So all that is left for them is something like the human excellence of theoretical wisdom and the activity of theoretical wisdom. Namely, of course, the activity of it is theorizing just for the sake of theorizing. So this gives us, for Aristotle, our picture, or something of a picture, of what the life of the gods is like. But how does Aristotle convince himself that divinity, understood in this way, should be a paragon for us? It is obvious that he's taking one facet of human life, namely the existence in human life of some theoretical activity. He's taking that and using it to give us a picture, or sort of image, if you like, of the divine life. But it doesn't follow just from this that we should positively embrace the project of living like gods ourselves. To get this conclusion, Aristotle perhaps just relies on the fact that a great deal of what we do in everyday life, both as individuals and as societies, is in fact designed to minimize our dependence and weakness, both physical and mental. Perhaps in the end, Aristotle's idea is that the sheer conatus for living and living well, that is our vitality, as indeed it's the vitality of all living beings, shows us to be essentially inclined towards godlikeness. And Aristotle may have thought that this is so obvious that no philosophical argument is needed. Some such consideration, I'm supposing, secures his version of the paragon model of God in relation to human ethics. And I should just say in here that even though this divine paragon is best approximated on the human level by the purely theoretical thinker, the purely theoretical human thinker, it is nonetheless deeply relevant to ethics and to practical life. Why? Because the choice to devote time and resources to theoretical activity and to supporting it in the society is a practical and ethical, and of course, in Aristotle's sense, a political decision. I'm turning now to the second and shorter, at least it is meant to be shorter, part of this paper. Its title, as I said, is Practicality and Perfectionism. The main purpose of this section is negative. It's to point out that today we seem not to have any convincing ways of articulating, and I mean by that philosophically articulating, the kind of importance that attaches to activities such as the activity of Aristotle's preeminent theorizer. I take it that today we are not going to find it satisfactory to express our sense of the importance that I'm talking about simply by saying, well, what is special about this and other such activities, for there may be many kinds of them, perhaps indefinitely many kinds, what's special about them that makes them so important is that in engaging with them, we are being godlike. That's not something that an analytic philosopher in the year 2014 is going to want to say. Which leaves us with the problem of what we as philosophers should say instead. But before looking at this problem in slightly more detail, I need to explain what I mean by the word perfectionism in the present context. By the term perfectionism, I do not mean what some philosophers mean by it. I think they have a slightly technical meaning, actually. They mean a type of moral theory or ethical theory that makes self-realization the central value in the system. Such philosophers are often anxious to argue that living a morally excellent life is one kind of self-realization, and perhaps the most important kind. But what I'm talking about is best exemplified in activities where intellectual and aesthetic values reign supreme, where every move has a point or a purpose, even if one can't always say in words what the purpose is, where precision, dexterity and technical skill are avidly developed, only not for their own sake, but for the sake of making the work of art or the work of literature or music or the work of science or the work of athletic performance in order to make these as perfect as possible. And I'm also going to think primarily of cases where these works on which all this perfectionist dedication is lavished are of a quality in themselves that brilliantly justifies or vindicates the investment. I do not think, though I can't defend this here because there isn't going to be time, at least in the paper, I do not think that the life of moral excellence is or should be perfectionist in the sense that I'm using here. I have in mind the day-to-day activity of a morally excellent person. I don't think that the idea of perfectionism captures what is admirable in a life filled with morally excellent conduct, including perhaps even some heroic conduct. There's a lot to say here which I have to pass over for reasons of time. But one thing which one can quickly say is that moral excellence is all about daily life. Even the heroic moral excellence is facing the kind of challenges that are in their kind come up in daily life. Whereas perfectionist activities involve, this is putting it very crudely, they involve escape from daily life. This contrast echoes a contrast between the authority model of God in human ethics and an Aristotelian version of the paragon model. Remember, an Aristotelian version of the paragon model says that God is to be our paragon only in some subsection of our life, which he identifies as leisure time. On this basis, we can say that in the authority model, given the comprehensiveness of its ethical relevance, God is a principle, as this of course is often said by religious people, God is a principle for the sanctification of daily tasks and daily duties, everyday tasks and everyday duties. Whereas in an Aristotelian paragon model, God stands for something in us, or something godlike in us, that needs and deserves to be freed from daily tasks and duties. So, to turn now to the question of this part of the paper, what do philosophers today have to say about the special importance of perfectionist activities or their special value for human life? My sense is that they have very little to say about this, although of course there may be relevant discussions which I don't know about. The discussion which I'm aware of tends to be focused on dilemmas in which somebody's moral duty conflicts with their following their calling as an artist or whatever, something like an artist. The great example always pointed to is that of the painter Gauguin, discussed first in this context by Bernard Williams in his, I think it's in his paper Moral Work. The question on which philosophers since Williams have focused is whether Gauguin's successful development of his talent somehow made it rationally justifiable or even morally justifiable that he abandoned, this is the story, I don't know whether this is true about Gauguin, but that's what I'm assuming. He abandoned his wife and children in Paris and went off to Tahiti. That there can even be a discussion of this, that is, whether it was rationally justifiable or even, as I think Williams sometimes tends to imply, somehow morally justifiable, even though they were not a rich family, they needed him to be there to look after them, etc. That there can even be a discussion of this implies the very great importance of perfectionist activities as compared with trivial pleasures. If perfectionist activities could even seem to compete for priority with a serious and major moral requirement, means that they must be very important. But what does this importance of theirs amount to? John Stuart Mill tried to give an answer in hedonist terms. The so-called higher pleasures are simply greater pleasures. That was what he, as it were, tried to, I'm not sure he was even convinced himself, he tried to lay down. But this is notoriously inadequate. Similarly, one gets very little light from the notions of people's interests and people's projects, which of course people have a right to pursue, at least if they're not impinging on other people's interests and other people's projects. To paraphrase, the reason one gets very little light from those ideas is that, to paraphrase Bentham, pushpin and poetry are both interests and projects that people have, or that some people have. One wants to say that there is a duty to cultivate perfectionist activities. That is, cultivating perfectionist activities should not just be a matter of personal inclination. Leaving these things to personal inclination risks over the long term, maybe it doesn't even have to be a very long term, risks the very existence of the institutions and ongoing practices that are needed to conserve and develop the skills that sustain perfectionist activities and enable them to be transmitted through the generations. But while acknowledging that one wants to say that there is a duty to cultivate perfectionist activities, it can't just be a matter of personal inclination. Is one morally deficient? As soon as you start to talk about duty, you seem to be talking about morality. Is someone morally deficient if he or she is untouched, whether through their own fault or not, by the magic of any perfectionist activity? Does it mean that one is a less good person, or to that extent that one is a bad person? Many of us would recoil from saying that. So, to seize another well-known category, are we to say that engaging in and otherwise supporting perfectionist activity is not a moral duty, but is rather supererogatory? It goes beyond the requirement of moral duty. This, as it were, might at first sight seem to somehow support our sense of the importance of these things, but not in a way that boxes us in to saying that someone is morally defective if they are not into perfectionist activities. But the category of supererogation cannot really help us, I think. In the typical examples of supererogatory actions, the agent makes some exceptional sacrifice, usually for someone else's good, where the good in question is a familiar one, such as life itself, the soldier who falls on the grenade to save his comrades. We all understand the value of what he does. It's just preserving people's lives at the great cost to himself. The good here is a familiar one. Shall we then say, and this is, as it were, the last suggestion that I'll briefly consider, shall we say concerning perfectionist activities that they are important because we have a moral duty to ourselves to cultivate our talents, where talents, of course, are assumed to be talents for those kinds of activities. Many philosophers today reject Kant's idea of moral duties towards ourselves, and in particular that it's a duty, a moral duty to develop one's talents. There is a tendency today to link moral duty entirely to altruism. However, my objection to this suggestion is a bit different. It is rather that it gets, or it may well get, things the wrong way round. It gets things the wrong way round to explain the importance of perfectionist activities in terms of a duty that we have to ourselves to cultivate our talents. Surely the reason that we ought to cultivate our talents is that the perfectionist activities for which they are talents are in themselves important. So what is this special importance of theirs? At the moment, philosophy seems to be silent on this question.